Alright, these are the last part of our notes dealing with the issue of slavery, and we're going to spend just a few minutes looking at life under slavery or life in slavery, which is really just kind of a broad topic to say. We're going to talk about slavery, some of the cruelties, possibly some of the positives, and how it's entrenched itself in American society. Alright? So I want you to first note the difference between a society with slaves and a slave society. A society with slaves is a society in which slavery is only one of several other systems of labor. This is something you would see very prominently in the North. Keep in mind what the North's economy is based on: industry. Industry can have a multitude of workers. Low-paid immigrant workers are flooding into factories of the North, and other such methods as that. Slavery is not an essential, integral part of this society. A slave society, on the other hand, is a society where slavery is the foundation of the economic and social order, such as in the South. The South is largely an agricultural economy, even though they do have a few but limited number of factories. And the social order is also established on top of slavery as well, because keep in mind, slaves are at the bottom, and even if you are a poor white family that can't hardly afford anything to eat, you are still of a higher class than a slave. So I want you to pay attention to that when you're discussing the issue of slavery: a slave society versus a society with slaves. Just to kind of reinforce the issue of slave society versus a society with slaves, I want you to look at the numbers and how they doubled over the years. In the North, New York might have had one of the largest gains in slavery in a short amount of time, from 1,200 to 8,996. And what these numbers show is the difference between the first count, or the first slave count, which have taken place, as it says over here, in 1680 in the colonies, and how those numbers compare to 1740. So you're looking at roughly 60 years later. New York went from 1,200 slaves to 8,996. Rhode Island's got a very small number over here, 175 to 2,000. Same with Massachusetts. New Hampshire, also a small number. New Jersey, slight increases. Connecticut, a very small number as well. And then, of course, Pennsylvania, which, keep in mind, it was founded, even though it was free of slaves, eventually acquired them over the time, and Philadelphia was definitely a part of that increase in slave numbers. But I want you to notice the difference between these number increases in the North versus the ones in the South. Starting with Maryland, they went from 1,600 to 24,000 in African American population, the majority of them being slaves. Virginia went from 3,000 to 60,000, again the majority being slaves. North Carolina, 210 to 11,000. South Carolina, 200 to 30,000. So you can see the South, how slavery kind of entrenched itself because of the agrarian society. Slave numbers went up very high for tobacco cultivation and eventually for cotton cultivation. So you can see it was really just the nature of the beast, the region, the economies of the region and what they were based on. And the South, as we know, is very much going to be involved in agriculture, in contrast to the North, who will first be heavily involved in the matters of trade and then later industry. You're talking about two economies, one where slavery is needed, it's a necessary evil, and one where slavery is just not needed. Now, life in slavery, or if you were an African American or a black at the time, what you could expect given the region of the country that you lived in. If you were in the North, blacks usually received some of the lowest paying jobs. There was very limited numbers of slaves. And the mindset of most Northerners at the time, the people you'd been living amongst, most of them are against slavery, or more specifically the extension of slavery, like we talked about with certain political parties, but definitely not for white and black equality. In the South, if you're black or an African, you're predominantly a slave, and these would differ between laborers, artisans, and a few factory jobs. 25% of Southern families owned slaves, so roughly 1/4 of the South had immediate ownership of slavery. Slave populations dramatically increase as the country develops and it gets closer to the Civil War. In 1810, the United States as a whole had 1.2 million. In 1830, you're talking about 2 million, so the number has increased 0.8 million in 20 years, or roughly 800,000. And then by the time you get up to 1860, you're up to 4 million, so it actually doubled in 30 years. And these numbers are located primarily in the South. However, these estimates are national estimates. In the 18th century, most slaves were recent arrivals, so throughout the 1700s you had slave trades coming through on the Middle Passage. By 1830, the majority are born in America, and they worked on large farms or plantations. Now, even though the majority of slave owners owned very few slaves, the main population of slaves lived on plantations. And what I mean by that is, let's say you've got 5 slave owners, they each own 10 slaves, that would equal roughly 50 slaves, all right? However, let's say down here we've got 1 slave owner, and he owns 500 slaves. So you can see the 1 slave owner, the massive plantation, would own the majority of the slaves, even though the majority of slave owners, which would be 5 versus 1, only own 10 or 50 total. Now, rural slavery, or slavery on the farmland, was quite different than urban slavery, slavery within cities. If you're out in rural or out in the country, slaves would usually be on plantations or small farms. Men, women, and children would work dawn to dusk in fields. The slaves might be whipped. They would have little time for food, breaks, or rest while working. However, these slaves would combat this, and they would find clever ways to get out of work. Breaking tools was an easy way to get out of a couple of hours or even a day's work. If the cotton gin went down, what's the point? Another way that slaves would do is they'd actually run away for the day, and then they would take the beating that they had to take the next day as they came back. So they would go off and hide. Now, not all slave owners brutally punished their slaves. We're going to read some accounts from Alexander Stephens and George, and we're going to see the very fair light picture that his slaves paint of him and how good he actually was to his servants. However, a lot of these narratives actually come back into the happy slave narrative, which deals with an issue of paternalism. A little bit about the happy slave narrative. These were a minority in the slave population. Very few slaves actually would return to their masters and work for them after the war because they felt so felt so highly of their masters. Some would return and work, to give credence to the notion that this did exist. Especially in the early or the mid 1900s, the happy slave was very much stereotyped by Hollywood, or as depicted down here with Mammy from the famous Gone with the Wind movie. Now, also in rural slavery, you would have the concept known as a house slave, which is right up here in bold. A house slave was a slave who worked and often lived in the house of the slave owner, and they would practically do everything: cooking, cleaning, serving meals, and caring for the children. And because they worked in close connection with the owners, they were often fed better than field slaves. They were clothed. It was usually hand-down clothes. They were housed, and they were provided with minimal medical care. In some instances, they were actually treated like the slave owner's children in that they were be educated alongside. Keep in mind, a house slave's child born into the house would usually be brought up doing house slave tasks. So more often than not, they would be educated alongside the children. And some are even Christianized, even though it was against the law. Remember what happened after the Nat Turner Revolt and how the South reacted to that. You've also got some instances of urban slavery, or slavery that would take place in the city. Some slaves were skilled. They were carpenters, for instance. And there were some southern cities that had manufacturing jobs. So some enslaved blacks would actually hire themselves out as artisans. Now, in a lot of cases, they wouldn't be allowed to keep their money. The money would go back to the owners. So slave owners, often than not, would be the ones hiring out their workers to factory owners. The treatment of slaves in skill jobs was often less cruel than on plantations because they are providing an actual skill and not just a field hand. And to close, I just kind of want to show you this map that was made right as the Civil War got underway, and really it's a depiction of the South and the spread of slavery in the South. If you notice, slavery is heavily entrenched on the coastal areas, and definitely so along the Mississippi River right here, where you have very, very fertile soil. Also, down the coastal areas through Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, up Georgia, South Carolina, into Virginia. The aspects of Maryland and Delaware that have slavery entrenched are actually on these coastal areas as well, where you have very good soil. The flatlands of Georgia and Alabama are also heavily entrenched with slavery, where you would have massive cotton production. The regions without slavery in the South are primarily the mountainous regions, where you wouldn't have this large agricultural-based economy. Most of the farmers in this area would be considered your yeoman farmers, as opposed to your massive cotton production. All right, so these are the notes on life and slavery, and make sure you pull the PowerPoints off of the class materials page.
Steve.